Actually, one big goal for us is we want to get to cash flow positive as soon as possible. Obviously, minus any infrastructure costs and man hours, stuff like that. But just on the base spend in terms of marketing and acquiring users versus the amount of intake we get from users, we want to make sure we're cash flow positive.
Working with highly ambitious teens has taught me that most high school students are anxious about their careers. They want internships at big companies, but often worry they don't have the incredible experiences that will help them stand out. In this founder fireside chat, we explore ways you can radically stand out, especially when applying for internships.
My name is Z. I like to think of myself as a startup enthusiast and a distributed systems nerd. For those of you who don't know what distributed systems are, basically just a bunch of computers talking to each other. I'm currently the head of product and co-founder at Belay, a fintech startup based out of SF. Previously, I've worked at, well, you've all seen the meme, I guess, various big tech companies. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for that intro. Z, one thing that we were talking about before we got into this session, when we were just planning this session out, is you've had almost a non-traditional background. When we traditionally think about folks that secure some of these impressive internships, Microsoft, Google, Tesla, really all the Infinity Stones, they have almost like a cookie cutter background. And something unique that you wanted to share was your kind of approach to getting there was a little bit different. Do you want to quickly share what you think you did differently than other students, or despite having your background, you were able to secure some of the most impressive internships known to all nerds out there?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think most of the times when you look on YouTube and you see those tech YouTubers are like, oh, I went to Waterloo, or oh, I went to Berkeley or Stanford, or et cetera, et cetera. I think that's typically what you tend to think of when you think of people who work at Google or any of these top companies. So for me, I went to the University of Ottawa, and it's a very not well-known school. And the software engineering program is, it's okay, but definitely not comparable to any Ivy League schools. So I think the biggest difference for me was that it was a lot harder to get my first internship at one of these big companies. I basically had to find ways to stand out in other ways aside from schooling. And how I did that was just doing as many side projects as I could. I would go to all these hackathons, try and network, try and build cool projects to put on my resume. And the other thing is I just applied a lot. So I know at Waterloo, they have this portal where all the top companies, they kind of go to the portal, and they basically make it super easy for Waterloo students to apply and interview and basically get an offer. Whereas for me, I basically had to manually go on each single website of all these companies, hit apply, fill out all their forms and all that stuff. And I think in first year, I must have applied to 130, 140 different companies. And not surprisingly, I got rejected by basically everyone. I think I got a total of 5 interviews out of the 130, which honestly, I was even lucky to get that. So definitely for me, it was really a numbers game, and then trying to find ways to express my abilities outside of school. But once I got my first internship at Microsoft, things got a lot easier.
Would you say then just getting that stamp, Microsoft almost acted like a stamp on your resume that allowed you to open up doors? So that was the key turning point in your career where things just became a lot easier. And up until then, it was a uphill battle.
Yeah, for sure. Once you get one big name on your resume, it becomes substantially easier to get more. There's a lot of signaling there. A lot of it is just these companies, what they'll do is when you submit your resume, they'll have a filter for top companies. And then if you've worked at one, you're much more likely to get an interview. And then from there on out, it's just making sure that you study hard for the interviews and you're able to pass them.
Right on. So up until Microsoft, you're a little too humble for this crowd, Z. I want you to maybe talk a little bit more about your work ethic and the things that you did to maybe initially secure that Microsoft internship. Because on our Insta, we made that post showcasing that you spent almost a month away from home doing back-to-back hackathons. You've worked on many side projects to even get that interview at Microsoft. You spent a lot of time honing in on your skills. And that initial upfront investment paid dividends down your career. So do you mind talking a little bit about the sort of activities you had to do to bypass the gate, to break through the gate, the little horse, the wooden horse gates.
Yeah, Billy's gates. Like you said, I remember in first year, the second semester, I spent a whole month basically just going to different universities and going to 36-hour long hackathons where I basically just spend the whole time coding and learning how to build services. Honestly, that was pretty tough. But I think the toughest part was actually passing the interview. So I think once you have enough projects on your resume and you just throw your resume at enough companies, and you'll probably get a few interviews. The hard part is actually passing them. For those of you who aren't in tech or who are not looking to apply anywhere yet, you might not know this website called LeetCode. It's basically this website that like has a bunch of these algorithm or computational programming questions. And all these top companies will ask you these during interviews. And it's very nerve-wracking. They're like brain teasers. Some of them can be very difficult. Basically, when you're not at one of the Ivy League schools or Waterloo, you don't really know that you need to practice for these. No one goes and tells you, oh, go on LeetCode and just practice that. So for me, it was a lot of exploring on the web and like seeing what other people were saying. And then I kind of got the gist that the most important thing is actually just to practice these problems. And then I remember in summer of first year when I was applying everywhere. In my first year summer, I was interning. I guess it was formerly a subsidiary of Intel, but I would basically wake up at 5 a.m., do 3 hours of LeetCode problems, and then drive an hour to work, come back, do another 2 hours of LeetCode, and then go to bed. And the next day, repeat and repeat and repeat. Because these problems, when it gets the harder levels or the higher levels, it can be like very challenging. Sometimes the problems are very, very difficult where you kind of just have to memorize the approach to them. And then so that if it comes up again.
A lot of like our audience is still in high school right now. Mm-hmm. Obviously, a lot of students here definitely look up to you. A lot of the labels and the signals that you have on your resume. I don't necessarily agree that's how you should look up to mentors and whatnot, but they definitely look up to you because of the internships you've secured, the work that you've put in. So if you were to talk to, let's say, high school Z, the Giga Chad, jacked dude, what sort of advice would you give to that Z if you want that Z to accelerate to where you're at right now?
I think the number one advice I'd give is actually just keep an open mind, really have more humility. I think when I was in high school, just like you said in your story, you feel like, oh, I'm pretty smart. I do pretty well in tests. I feel like I know a good amount of things, but realistically, I mean, you're 16, you're 17, you know nothing really. Yeah. I know you guys out there, you guys are probably also like top of your class, excelling in all your activities. So I think that's just something important to keep in mind is that there are really like truly incredible people out there. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. There's a period in high school where I wouldn't say afraid, but I would hesitate to try new things or get out there in fear of like looking stupid or like you don't want your pride to kind of hinder you from learning and growing.
So I think what you've given like in terms of advice is somewhat conflicting. A part of that advice you've given to students is put your pride aside and get out of your comfort zone and don't be afraid. And that's like, to me, sounds like that confidence piece. But the second part that you mentioned is you don't know anything either. There's still a lot left to learn. How do you balance those two? How would you like further clarify this for high school students?
I think confidence is not the opposite of humility. I think pride is the opposite of humility. I think confidence comes from knowing that you will get there eventually, knowing that as long as you put in the work, you will improve and get better. And I think humility is just saying that there's a lot I don't know. There's a lot I need to improve on. Because if you don't know that, you will never actually seek to improve. If you already think you're the best, you're not going to keep improving. I think ever since I started university, I've always wanted to eventually get into startups and be a startup founder myself. But I was basically not from Stanford. That's the main point. I realized that I needed to get a lot more credentials in order to have appeal to VCs and attract other talent essentially to join my team. And also just like network, right? As part of that, my goal was to get these big name companies on my resume. Obviously, working there was enjoyable and was fun as well, but definitely it was to serve the greater goal of eventually becoming a startup founder. From each internship, I kind of learned something new, different aspects of company building. And eventually I also landed the Kleiner Perkins Fellowship, Kleiner Perkins is a venture capital company. And it's kind of like a bunch of founder series where you get to speak with founders of their portfolio companies.
I know there's a lot of cool Kleiner Perkins KP companies out there. Do you mind just giving like the audience like a quick rundown of some of like the big names that they'd recognize?
Well, most apps on your phone, Airbnb, Uber, Google, basically most of the apps on your phone, you could probably find them there.
So you got to this point where you were like hunting down credentials because the ultimate North Star was becoming a co-founder. So I know you also worked with a few startups. Do you mind walking us through then how the idea of Belay came to be? How did you get involved with Belay?
I actually wasn't the original founder of Belay. So I joined the team honestly pretty, well, I wouldn't say late, but they were like already several months into ideation and building some form of MVP. And it was actually on my internship at Databricks that one of my teammates, he was a fellow intern. I remember this like very clearly. This is really funny. We were in the middle of a team meeting and our manager was there. There were like 12 people on the call. And we were just doing a daily stand-up, so like where we kind of report what we worked on, our progress. And just out of nowhere, he blurts out, "Does anyone here like building startups?" And it was completely unsolicited. And I was like, what is this guy thinking? And then, obviously it piqued my interest. And I have to follow up with him after and see what he's working on. Right. I called him afterwards and he pitched me the idea. I think as a software engineering student, generally you get approached by a lot of business people and they'll come to you with this, "Oh my God, I have this next level startup idea. It's going to be the next big thing." Okay, I won't swear, but it's crap. It's very terrible. The idea is very terrible. He pitched me the idea of Belay and I thought, it really makes sense. They did their research really well. They had a bunch of the unit economics down right and the team looked very capable. So I was like, yeah, let's do this.
Do you mind explaining what Belay does?
So Belay is an income stabilization service for gig workers. Right now, we're focused specifically on Uber drivers. As you guys can imagine, Uber drivers, their income, it varies a lot week to week. It can be $500 one week. It could be $2,000 the next week. It completely depends on the demand, right? Say there's a big concert in town, they're going to get a lot of ride requests to and from the concert. And then that week their pay spikes. This type of model is really bad for these drivers because typically they live on thin balance sheets, meaning they don't have much money in their bank accounts. And then whenever they have a slow week and they can't pay their bills, they fall into this really, really predatory debt cycle. So we're kind of here to prevent that. So what we do is we take Uber data and we forecast how much they're going to make, and we pay them a flat hourly wage in exchange for a small service fee. And then in turn, this also helps them build credit. That way they can apply for credit cards, get lower interest on loans, et cetera, et cetera.
Right on. So you basically mentioned it's for any gig workers. Right now, you're niche down into just Uber drivers specifically, or maybe any ride hailing service. I guess that falls into that broad category. At what point do you think it makes sense to like further expand out of that initial niche you've built out? And like what other areas, other gig workers have you guys been thinking about expanding to?
Yeah, great question. First, what we want to do is we want to make sure all our numbers look good. That being making sure our LTV is high, our CAC is low, making sure that retention is high, conversion is solid. Once all these numbers check out, and we have a solid kind of base of users in one vertical or one industry, then we can start looking towards other ones.
Okay. I don't want to get into too many MVP related questions just because we're going to be walking through like a session on that. And I don't want to give spoilers to the beta camp students. They'll definitely take advantage of that. But I think where Belay is probably like the most exciting stage of a startup. It's that initial momentum. Like you guys are getting that initial traction. You're at that pre-seed stage right now. When you're working with like investors and especially in like the current economy right now, what sort of factors do other entrepreneurs have to think about in terms of like raising money? And I'm curious if that's on the time horizon for Belay.
For us, we want to hit a certain user target first, and then making sure that our retention numbers and LTV look good. And then we'll probably approach investors for a seed round. So given the current climate of the markets, I would say something that's very important is making sure your runway is long enough. Actually, one big goal for us is we want to get to cash flow positive as soon as possible. Like obviously minus any like infrastructure costs and man hours, stuff like that. But just on the base spend in terms of marketing and acquiring users versus the amount of intake we get from users, we want to make sure we're cash flow positive. And I think especially since funding is generally drying up, I think it's slightly better for seed stage because the check sizes are smaller. That is something to keep in mind. And that is also something investors will want to see, that you have a solid plan to get to cash flow positive in case you stall raising a Series A or Series B.
Yeah. I think when we got dinner like a few weeks back, you said there was a lot of dumb money flying around, and this current economy is kind of just forced the folks that maybe who are kind of silly with their money, it's kind of eradicated them. So you have to be a lot smarter with how you're planning to grow. And I think your team has been doing a fantastic job. I'm curious, like when you initially joined Belay, and one thing we talk about a lot during beta camp is a lot of early stage companies have to make a lot of pivots, right? You need to consistently have hypotheses, test these hypotheses, validate the data, just to ensure you're allocating your hours and your time and your dev resources appropriately. the worst thing you want to do is build something no one wants. And that's what I keep telling our like students, like what you're building is actually something that people want. I'm curious if you've had to do any crazy pivots, or not even pivots, like a crazy pivots in general, but just any pivots.
That's actually a pretty tough question. And it's not something that like has a very clear-cut answer, at least in my opinion, because there's like a variety of factors. Your product could be failing, or like your idea could be failing for a variety of reasons. Maybe your outreach is poor, your targeted advertising is poor, you're targeting the wrong user base. Maybe you're not spending enough money on ads. One of the biggest learnings I've taken away from Belay is make sure to really track metrics, because that's what tells you what's wrong with your business. So for us, one thing we kind of noticed recently is that our retention past 4 or 5 months drops some amount, and we're trying to reduce that. And to do so, we're kind of pivoting. We're doing it like a very small pivot. So it's still the same concept, but we're changing our payment structure a little bit, changing how the finance model works a little bit so that it's a bit more intuitive for users and a little bit, I guess, friendlier for them to stay on for multiple months in a row. It's really hard to say. It really depends on your specific situation, right, on knowing when to pivot and when not to.
The most important thing is collecting a lot of data and having the foresight of being able to analyze that well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. I'm a little cognizant of time because we also have to run to the Beta Camp exclusive session. But I want to ask this for everyone, because there's a lot of entrepreneurs here, aspiring entrepreneurs as well. Did you feel you were ready to start a company or be an early member to an early stage company? And how did you kind of realize it was like the right time?
I don't think you're ever fully ready. You might be somewhat mentally prepared, right? You might think, okay, I can build an app, I can do this, do that. But there's just so much stuff that comes with building a startup that is unexpected. There's a lot of hardships. A lot of it's purely emotional, to be honest. The important thing is to just start, just try. If you fail, fail fast and try again. That's the way to go.
Right on. And then final question, and then we'll wrap this portion of the panel up. If there were skills you struggled with getting, and were there any skills that you felt you're still working on right now? And because learning is like an infinite cycle, right?
One thing I'm trying to improve right now specifically is getting better at user interviews, especially because we're working with a population that doesn't speak English very well most of the time, and they're also not super tech savvy. I really have to try and find ways to simplify the conversation or be able to get information out of them that, for example, let's say you're building a product for a software company. It's very easy to speak with someone there, right? You use the same tech lingo, you're in the same kind of domain. But with these drivers, right, you have to kind of find unique ways to get information out of them.
Are there any cool anecdotes, the user research part, where you've had to modify how you do user research at this point?
We've done that. Yeah. We've walked people through the entire sign-up process on like a 40-minute call just using Google Translate.
So improving that user research piece, that's like the biggest thing you're currently working on. Are there any strategies you're working towards to get better at it? Or
I think one important thing is just enlarging sample size. When you don't get super conclusive results from each specific user, just largening the sample size tends to help a lot. We're actively trying to interview more and more of our users and potential users.
Right on. All right. So I think this wraps up like this first portion of this panel. It'll be nicer to see the people you're inspiring as well.